In this video, we uncover the darkest deeds and moral wounds carved by Alexander's ambition, from bloodied betrayals and mass slaughter to cultural ruin and the silencing of dissent. You'll see that behind the laurels and legends lurks a man of ruthless extremes. If you enjoy critical history with a twist of mystery, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Now let's begin the tale. He was barely 20 when the crown of Macedonia fell upon his head, yet already the young Alexander carried himself not as a man, but as an omen. His father, Philip II, had forged a powerful kingdom, but it was Alexander who would drench it in both glory and terror. His ascent began not with diplomacy or mercy, but with fire. The first to feel his wrath was Thebes, a city once proud, a city that dared to challenge him. When whispers of rebellion reached his ears, he saw not a threat, but an opportunity to show the world that defiance would be answered with annihilation. The siege was swift and merciless. Macedonian troops encircled the walls while Alexander, calm as a god of war, watched the city fall piece by piece. Once the defenses collapsed, Thebes was consumed. Men were slaughtered in the streets, their cries echoing off the stones that once held poetry and philosophy. Women and children were dragged into slavery. Houses that had stood for generations went up in smoke. It is said that only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar were spared, a token of Alexander's twisted reverence for art amid the ruin he created. With one command, he erased an entire city from the map of Greece. The message was unmistakable. Rebellion would be punished not with defeat but extinction. In that moment, Alexander was no longer a boy king. He became a specter of fear. Greek city-states that might have wavered bent their knees in silence. Athens, shaken to its core, chose submission over ruin. The world began to see him not merely as a ruler, but as something closer to divine wrath. He encouraged that illusion, weaving himself into the fabric of myth, aligning his image with Achilles, Heracles, and the gods of Olympus. Yet behind the hero's facade grew a hunger, not for justice or unity, but for domination, a hunger that devoured empathy before it could take root. Even in Macedonia, where loyalty should have been certain, Alexander ruled through intimidation. When conspiracies surfaced, some real, others imagined, he acted without hesitation. Rivals were executed, allies exiled. His rise was painted in the blood of those who had once shared his table. Among his victims was Attalus, a general tied to his father's legacy, slain on Alexander's orders to prevent potential dissent. Each death served a purpose, to remind all who served him that proximity to power was a dangerous gift. His army adored him, yet they feared him just as deeply. Alexander demanded absolute obedience and punished hesitation as betrayal. To his soldiers, he was both savior and executioner, capable of rewarding valor with riches, but just as capable of burning a man's life to ashes for the smallest act of defiance. Through fear, he built loyalty. Through violence, he sculpted order. His control over Greece was not born from admiration, but from the terror that followed in his wake. The philosopher Aristotle had once been his tutor, teaching him reason and virtue. But the student who had once debated ethics in quiet gardens now wielded philosophy like a weapon, a justification for conquest. He spoke of uniting mankind, of bringing light to barbarian lands, yet his first lessons in leadership were written in slaughter. Each campaign became a ritual of purification, purging disobedience as if it were a stain on destiny. The world began to whisper stories about him, of his golden hair shining under the sun like a divine omen, of how he marched with the certainty of prophecy. But those who saw him up close knew there was something darker behind his calm gaze. In Thebes, the dust had barely settled when new expeditions began. Greece lay silent and broken behind him, and Alexander turned his eyes eastward. He had secured his throne not through the hearts of men, but through the echoes of their screams. He believed the gods had chosen him for greatness, yet the path he carved toward that greatness was paved with bones. What began as a campaign of unification had already become a lesson in terror. And as the embers of Thebes cooled beneath the Macedonian sun, Alexander's legend was just beginning, not the legend of a liberator, but of a conqueror whose ambition would consume the world itself. When Alexander crossed into Asia, he claimed he was not invading but avenging. The Persian Empire, he declared, had once wronged Greece, and now he would bring justice with sword and fire. Yet, what began as vengeance soon became something far more personal, a hunger for domination that eclipsed all pretense of righteousness. His march through Persia was not merely a conquest of lands, it was the slow unraveling of his humanity, replaced by the cold logic of destruction. At first, his victories seemed touched by destiny. At the Granicus River, his cavalry shattered Persian defenses, their bodies piling like offerings to a new god of war. In every city that fell, he was hailed as a liberator. Yet liberation under Alexander came with chains. Those who resisted were annihilated. Those who submitted found their culture stripped and their temples desecrated. He called himself the Avenger of Greece, but his methods mirrored the very tyranny he claimed to oppose. As he advanced deeper into Persian territory, the brutality escalated. The ancient city of Tyre, proud and defiant, became a lesson in his relentless cruelty. After 7 months of siege, his army breached the walls, and the punishment was absolute. Thousands were slaughtered, others crucified along the shore, a grim forest of corpses left as warning to all who might resist. Alexander watched it all in silence, not as a man appalled by carnage, but as an artist admiring his work. Then came Persepolis, the beating heart of the Persian Empire, a city of opulence, wisdom, and unimaginable wealth. When he entered its gates, even his soldiers were struck by awe. Here stood the palaces of kings, the carved symbols of centuries of empire. For a fleeting moment, some accounts say, Alexander hesitated. Perhaps he saw the ghosts of Darius and Cyrus in the marble halls. Perhaps he felt the weight of what he was about to destroy. But the hesitation did not last. At a drunken feast, surrounded by his officers and courtesans, the queen of debauchery herself, Thais, whispered that the city should burn as vengeance for Greece. Whether it was the wine, the flattery, or the madness of power, Alexander agreed. Torches were lit, and the flames consumed Persepolis. The fire devoured not only wood and stone, but memory itself, libraries, art, temples, the collected spirit of a civilization. As the smoke curled into the night, Alexander stood watching, the conqueror of the greatest empire on earth and the destroyer of its soul. The destruction of Persepolis marked a turning point. From that night on, Alexander was no longer a mere general seeking victory. He was an emperor shaping destiny with cruelty as his chisel. Yet his paranoia deepened with every step forward. Persian governors who questioned his rule were executed under accusations of treachery. Satraps were purged, sometimes without trial, their lands seized, their families erased. To maintain order, he built chaos. To create unity, he sowed fear. Even among his companions, suspicion festered. Men who had marched with him since Macedon began to vanish. Exiled, disgraced, or dead. Those who dared to question his methods were labeled traitors. In Persia, Alexander did not merely conquer cities, he conquered identities. He forced his men to adopt Persian customs, to kneel before him as if he were divine. The same warriors who had once shared his table now bowed their heads in uneasy silence. To his enemies, he was a monster of legend. To his followers, a god who had forgotten the meaning of restraint. His empire stretched wider than any before it, but every victory demanded a sacrifice. Cities in ruin, cultures obliterated, histories turned to ash. Alexander believed he was creating a new world, a bridge between East and West. But beneath that dream lay the bones of countless innocents. By the time he reached the far edges of Persia, the golden hero of Macedon had been replaced by something darker. He wore the robes of Persian kings, demanded worship as a deity, and spoke of destiny as if it were his to command. The fire that had once burned only in his ambition now consumed everything around him, and he would not stop until the whole world was swallowed by it. By the time Alexander reached the edges of Persia, the legend of his invincibility had already swept across continents. Yet beyond those conquered lands lay the vast unknown, Central Asia, and beyond it, India, a realm whispered about in awe and fear. To most men, that horizon marked the end of the world. To Alexander, it was merely another promise to conquer. What awaited him there, however, was not glory, but the slow unraveling of his sanity, and a darkness that would eclipse even his earlier cruelties. The march into Central Asia was less a campaign and more a trial by torment. His army trudged through deserts and mountains, where the air itself seemed hostile. Supplies vanished, thirst turned men into ghosts, and yet Alexander pressed on, obsessed with reaching a world that might finally acknowledge his divinity. Villages that resisted were burned to ash. Those that surrendered were plundered anyway. He claimed these acts were punishment for rebellion, but in truth they had become ritual, violence for the sake of control. In the region of Sogdiana, resistance flickered like wildfire. Local leaders, hardened by the terrain, refused to kneel. Alexander responded with merciless precision. Cities were besieged and their inhabitants massacred. Captives were crucified along roadsides as warnings to others who might think of defiance. One fortress, known as the Sogdian Rock, stood atop an impossible cliff. When the defenders mocked him, saying his men would need wings to take it, Alexander simply ordered volunteers to climb. Many fell to their deaths, but enough reached the summit to slaughter the defenders. When the stronghold fell, Alexander smiled. He had proven that not even the sky could defy him. It was here that he met Roxana, a local noblewoman renowned for her beauty. He took her as his wife. Some say out of love, others say as a political gesture to pacify the region. But even this act of union carried the shadow of conquest. His soldiers whispered that he had begun to adopt the airs of an Eastern despot, surrounding himself with luxury, demanding divine honors and treating his men less as comrades and more as subjects. As he pushed further east, toward the fabled lands of India, exhaustion gnawed at his army. Years of endless campaigning had stripped away their spirit, but Alexander refused to relent. When the Hydaspes River lay before them, guarded by King Porus and his massive war elephants, he saw not danger but destiny. The battle was brutal. Elephants trampling men, spears piercing flesh, chaos painted in blood and thunder. Yet Alexander triumphed. When Porus was brought before him, wounded but unbroken, Alexander asked how he wished to be treated. The king answered simply, "Like a king." And for once Alexander's cruelty faltered. He spared Porus, granting him back his lands, perhaps recognizing in him the reflection of what he himself had once been. Proud, unyielding, noble before ambition had turned to madness. But mercy was fleeting. Not long after, his army, worn and hollow, refused to march further east. They had followed him through death, famine, and horror, but India's endless rain and jungles broke what was left of their will. For the first time, Alexander faced rebellion not from cities, but from his own men. Their silence was not defiance, it was exhaustion. He raged, pleaded, threatened, but their eyes no longer burned with faith. They had seen too much blood. They wanted to go home. When he finally agreed to turn back, it was not an act of compassion, but of pride wounded beyond repair. He chose a different route, a punishment disguised as strategy, leading his troops through the Gedrosian desert. The march was a nightmare. Heat scorched the earth, water turned to dust, and thousands perished. Men drank from the stagnant blood of their horses. The desert swallowed entire divisions, their bones left bleaching beneath the sun. Alexander survived, but what emerged from that wasteland was not a god, not a hero, only a man consumed by the myth of himself. When the survivors reached the safety of civilization, the world saw Alexander crowned in glory, yet those who had marched beside him saw something else entirely. A tyrant who had traded humanity for legend. He had conquered the ends of the earth, but the farther he went, the more hollow his victories became. The deserts and rivers of India had shown him no enemies greater than himself, and in the silence that followed, the conqueror began to sense that even the world might not be enough to satisfy his hunger. The further Alexander drifted from home, the more the line between conquest and obsession blurred. The man who once dreamed of uniting the world under reason now ruled through fear and suspicion. His victories had made him untouchable, but they had also left him isolated, a god surrounded by trembling mortals. And like all men who begin to believe their own divinity, he started to see betrayal in every shadow. Philotas was among the first to feel the sting of that paranoia. A trusted general, the son of Parmenion, one of Alexander's oldest allies, Philotas had fought beside him since the early campaigns. Yet rumors began to swirl. Whispers that Philotas had mocked Alexander's claim to divine ancestry, that he had failed to report a plot against the king. Whether the accusations were true hardly mattered. Alexander's trust had turned brittle, and in his court, doubt was a death sentence. Philotas was arrested, tortured, and executed, but the cruelty did not end there. To erase the root of any supposed conspiracy, Alexander ordered the death of Parmenion as well, a man who had guided him since youth. Parmenion was not even granted a trial. A courier carried the death order, and a blade fulfilled it. In killing them both, Alexander severed the last link to his father's generation, replacing loyalty with fear. From that moment, the air around him thickened with dread. His court became a theater of paranoia, his tent a place where laughter could turn to accusation without warning. The more he demanded reverence, the less he trusted those who offered it. Wine, once a companion in celebration, became his weapon and his weakness. His banquets grew longer, his temper shorter. In drunken fits, he swung between godlike generosity and monstrous rage. The night he killed Clitus would forever mark the collapse of the man behind the myth. Clitus the Black, brave, seasoned, loyal, had once saved Alexander's life in battle. But loyalty meant little to a king who had begun to mistake obedience for worship. During a feast heavy with drink, Clitus dared to speak the truth, that Alexander owed his victories not to divine favor, but to the blood and sweat of Macedonian men. The words struck like daggers. Alexander's pride ignited, and amid shouting and shattered cups, he seized a spear and drove it through Clitus's chest. Silence fell over the hall, broken only by the sound of a dying friend gasping for air. When the rage faded, Alexander saw the horror of what he'd done. He wept, he raved, he begged the gods for forgiveness, but forgiveness could not erase what power had made of him. The tears were real, but they changed nothing. The man who once commanded loyalty now inspired terror. After that night, his decline deepened. His court turned into a nest of whispers and flattery. Those who flattered him lived. Those who reminded him of mortality vanished. He began adopting Persian customs more openly, demanding that his generals bow before him, that they call him the son of Zeus Ammon. To Macedonian soldiers, this was blasphemy. Their king had become a god in his own mind, yet none dared challenge him outright. They had seen what happened to Clitus, to Philotas, to any man who crossed him. His drinking sprees grew more violent, his temper more unpredictable. He surrounded himself with soothsayers and mystics who fed his delusions, interpreting every omen as proof of his divine mission. The generals who had once laughed beside him now watched their words carefully, knowing that even silence could be taken as rebellion. The camaraderie of old had evaporated, replaced by the suffocating air of a court built on fear. And yet, even as he unraveled, his charisma remained, terrible, magnetic, inescapable. His soldiers still followed him, not out of devotion, but because his legend had swallowed them all. They had seen him survive wounds that should have killed him, scale walls that defied gravity, march through deserts that devoured armies. He seemed immortal. But in truth, immortality was the lie that was slowly killing him. Every betrayal he imagined, every ghost he created, drove him further from the man he had once been. The boy who had tamed Bucephalus and dreamed of noble conquest was gone, replaced by a ruler who saw loyalty as weakness and mercy as treachery. His empire expanded, but his mind contracted, folding in on itself until all that remained was suspicion. By the time he reached Babylon, surrounded by generals who spoke softly and smiled too carefully, Alexander's greatest enemy was no longer Persia, nor India, nor the edge of the world. It was the madness within his own heart. When Alexander finally vanished from the world, the silence he left behind was almost unbearable. For over a decade, his name had meant motion, armies advancing, empires collapsing, civilizations bending to his will. And then, suddenly, it stopped. His death at 32 was not just the end of a man, but the implosion of an entire era. Yet even in death, he remained both miracle and menace. What he left behind was not peace, not unity, but a wound so vast it would take centuries for the world to scar over. The empire he built was never meant to last. It had no roots, only ashes. Each territory he conquered had been stripped of its rulers, its traditions shattered to fit the mold of his ambition. He spoke of blending East and West, of creating a single enlightened civilization. But what he truly created was confusion, a collision of worlds forced to coexist under the shadow of one man's dream. When he died, that fragile balance crumbled instantly. His generals turned on one another like starving wolves, dividing the carcass of his empire into fragments. Greece, Egypt, Persia, India all became battlefields once again, drenched in the blood of those who once fought beside him. Culturally, his conquest was both a bridge and a fire. Greek ideas spread across Asia. Yes, philosophy, art, language, but so too did destruction. Libraries burned, temples were looted, local traditions erased in favor of Hellenic dominance. His soldiers intermarried with conquered peoples, but it was not unity, it was absorption. Where his name was carved, native gods were silenced. Entire lineages vanished under his civilizing hand. What scholars later called the Hellenistic world was, in truth, the echo of 1,000 crushed cultures, reassembled into a mosaic of loss. Even the cities he founded, those proud monuments bearing his name from Alexandria in Egypt to the distant frontiers of Asia, became hollow symbols of his obsession with immortality. They were built to glorify him, not to nurture those who lived within them. Their architecture was Greek, their administration Greek, their language Greek. For the people whose lands he had claimed, each new Alexandria was a reminder that their own histories had been rewritten. The world had been remade in his image, and it would take centuries for it to remember itself again. And yet, as time passed, the memory of his cruelty began to fade. The myths grew louder, polishing away the screams beneath them. He became the golden conqueror, the young god, the visionary. Artists painted him with divine light. Philosophers excused his massacres as the price of destiny. In every century that followed, leaders and empires invoked his name: Napoleon, Caesar, even modern tyrants, each claiming to walk the same path of greatness. They saw only the crown, never the corpses beneath it. But history, when stripped of poetry, tells a different story. Behind every triumphal march stood fields of bones. Behind every city he civilized stood a nation erased. Alexander's ambition was not creation, but consumption, an endless hunger disguised as glory. He believed he was spreading enlightenment, but enlightenment cannot grow from conquest. What he truly spread was instability, a pattern of empires rising and collapsing in imitation of his own. His death did not end his destruction, it multiplied it, echoing through generations of rulers who mistook domination for destiny. Even today, his name glitters in textbooks and monuments, preserved by admiration rather than truth. We still call him the Great, though few stop to ask what greatness truly means. Is it measured in territory, in victory, in legend, or in the suffering left behind? If greatness is the power to change the world, then yes, Alexander was great. But if greatness also demands wisdom, mercy, or vision beyond the self, then perhaps he was only vast, a storm mistaken for a sunrise. His empire is gone, his language diluted, his cities worn by centuries of sand and sea. But his shadow lingers, not as inspiration, but as a warning, a reminder that ambition without conscience is the most seductive form of evil. Alexander sought to become a god, and in a way he succeeded, for like the old gods he demanded worship, left ruin, and disappeared into myth, immortal, untouchable, and never held accountable for the devastation that followed in his name. And in that silence, the greatest of his evils endures, that the world still calls him great.